Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being here halfway through day 2. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Let me start by thanking the organizers for putting on a fantastic conference and for inviting me. And even before she has the chance to speak, let me thank Eva for her comments, not just the comments to come, but incredibly useful comments that she's kindly already provided on an earlier draft of this presentation. So what I'd like to do today is I want to tell you about an experiment in labor economics, which I ran in Ethiopia with my co-authors, Gira Mabebe from the Ethiopian Development Research Institute, Marcel Fafchon from Stanford, and Michael Kerler at Oxford. And this is an experiment that tries to bring together firms and potential workers and spend a month together. We want to track the labor market outcomes of that. So what I want to do in this talk is I want to spend about 20 minutes telling you in overview how the experiment ran and showing you our estimates of the average treatment effects. Then I want to spend the second half of the presentation talking particularly about the mechanism design aspects, because we match the two sides of the market using a deferred acceptance algorithm. So I want to try to characterize the preferences that we think went into the construction of rankings for that algorithm, and then use that to think about what would have happened if we'd used different mechanisms within that treatment. The basic idea is well summarized, I think, by this graphic. To this day, I don't know if this is a joke or meant seriously. This is some instructions I found online, speaking about cheap and rubbish advice, and with a zero marginal cost. This is someone's instructions on how to ride a bicycle. Any of us who have ever ridden a bicycle will know that if this is your approach to learning how to ride a bicycle, this is the outcome. And the basic question is simple. What if managerial skills, or similarly, although not identically, entrepreneurial skills, are a little bit like riding a bicycle? Now, we're not the first to ask this question. Hayek wrote about this many years ago. Terence and co-authors in the AEJ this year have a fascinating experiment with microenterprises on exactly this kind of question, the difference between context-specific experiences versus general information. So what we want to do in this experiment is ask the following question. Can aspiring entrepreneurs acquire management skills by observing managers in large firms? What we did is we placed aspiring Ethiopian entrepreneurs into established medium and large firms. And there's two types of assignment here. First, am I in the treatment group or the control group? That was done in a randomized way. And then if I end up in the treated group, which of the set of firms is going to host me? This was done using a Gale-Shapley matching algorithm. Now this allows us to estimate two different kinds of effects. First is, what's the average treatment effect, or if you prefer the ITT, of assignment to participate, in other words, treatment minus control. But second, what's the heterogeneous effects based on the performance of the matching algorithm? If we can answer the second question in a credible way, then we open up all sorts of possibilities to speculate in a careful manner about what would have happened if we'd used different mechanisms. And I'll try to make some progress on that today. Now, spoiler alert, what are we going to find? On average, our treatment increases permanent wage employment but has no effect on self-employment. Treated individuals are more confident, at least in the way that what they express about their management skills. And among those treated individuals who are running small firms, it's not all of them by a long shot, but among that subsample, the treated individuals have better management practices. Let me say throughout, I'm not going to say much at all in this talk about measurement of management practices, but in effect what we're doing is using Bloom and Van Reenen's World Management Survey questions for thinking about large firms, and then Chris Woodruff and David McKenzie's adaptation of those questions to measure management practices in microenterprises. Among those assigned to the internship, what we're going to do is do a median split to ask whether this person was assigned to a host firm who had management practices at baseline above the median. We'll call that a high management host. We're going to ask whether there is a causal effect of being assigned to a high management as opposed to a low management firm, and that's what I want to talk about towards the end of the presentation. Why does this matter? Well, there's now a body of evidence that suggests, I think quite persuasively, that differences in management matter for firm performance and productivity. This is for several reasons. It matters for foregoing productive investments, for hiring and retaining good workers. There's obviously still much to be learned about what we in a rather grandiose manner call the production function for better managers. And I've already mentioned Terence's paper that's in this space this year. And in particular, this literature tends to emphasize importance of heterogeneous implementation and heterogeneous exposure. And that's going to be the theme, as I say, of the second part of this presentation. So how did we run this experiment? Well, we invited young Ethiopians, and we insisted that those young Ethiopians have a minimum of technical, vocational, college or university qualifications. This immediately makes them quite different to your standard kind of microenterprise sample, but that's the intention. And we advertised through a number of different mechanisms with the following headline message: do you want to be your own boss? See how successful firms work. Gain business and management skills firsthand. So if you're thinking, Simon, this is not a representative sample of Ethiopian youth, my answer is absolutely not, and it's not intended to be. We deliberately sample from a population that we think are the relevant population for thinking about this kind of management intervention, and the population that government policy in this space would be trying to affect. Now, the management experience itself takes placements, which I'll interchangeably refer to as internships. It puts people in a firm for 4 weeks, in a medium to large firm, mostly in Addis Ababa, but also a little bit in the neighboring towns of Adama and Bishoftu. It required a full-time commitment from the firm, and we paid a small stipend, which was basically, excuse me, calibrated just to think about offsetting, for example, costs of transport and so on, which were not otherwise going to be paid. And we randomized in a way that I won't talk about. We randomized on the firm side. I won't say much about that. I'm talking today about the interns primarily. But let me tell you a little bit about the firms. They hosted between 1 and 5 interns each. We've got firms across a range of different services. Crucially, and I'm, if I may say so, proud of this fact, these are not small firms. The median firm has 57 employees. So for the African context, this is medium and large firms. We think that's important if we're trying to think about encouraging people to adopt better management practices. Let me jump on. As I mentioned before, the sample that we looked for, it was a particular sample. Here we've got young, highly educated, highly motivated Ethiopians. And you'll see the basic characteristics: 75% male, 75% have a college degree, and they report actively searching for a wage job or planning to start or expand a business. So how do we match the interns and the firms? Well, we've got approximately 650 applicants. In round numbers, we took 825 of them and assigned them to treatment, 825 and assigned to control, and of the 825 who were treated, they were hosted by about 350 firms. To preempt perhaps some questions, we think that there are approximately 0 interaction effects in a meaningful economic sense between different interns. So for when I start to talk about heterogeneous effects, we're going to think of these as essentially sort of 825 host slots. Now, for logistical reasons, we implemented this on a rolling basis. And what that means is that every, I think it was a Monday morning, we would have a batch of prospective interns who would turn up. They would be randomized into treatment and control. The control group would be thanked for their time and unceremoniously kicked out the door. The treated group would then be asked to stay around after lunch. And they would get a little bit of an induction to the nature of the internship, and then they would be asked to carry out a ranking exercise. Specifically, what they had to do is they were given a small set of information, which we control, about the prospective host firms. That's to say, the prospective host firms who were available to host this batch of 20 interns. So the host firms that were hosting this Monday's batch are not the same necessarily as the host firms hosting next Monday's batch. So I'm going to be given basic information about those firms who are hosting my batch of interns, and I'm going to be asked to rank them. We then formed a stylized CV, I'll show you in a minute, for each of our prospective interns. We had a guy, I'm pretty sure he rode a motorcycle, and insofar as one could zip around Addis Ababa, and I have another paper showing that you can't, the transport costs are time costs are substantial, but he would move as quickly as he could to different firms. He would sit down with the managers or the HR managers of those firms where possible, and he would hand over approximately 20 stylized CVs and ask the manager to rank those CVs. So we end up within each batch with 2 sides of the market, each having expressed strict rankings over the other side. We then match interns and firms with a deferred acceptance matching algorithm, and within that algorithm, we had the firm side proposing. So what does the stylized CV look like? In the Ethiopian context, it's a stylized fact that you might think young people don't have CVs. In fact, the opposite is the problem. A lot of young people will carry a large chunk of papers around with all sorts of certification for various courses they did. In order to standardize this and to control the information set that was passed to firms, we had the young people fill out a CV on this template, in Amharic, of course. So just to show you the information that we're passing on, we've got their age, gender, school attended, something about level of education, name of the university, field of study, years of work experience, and so on. So quite short, quite stylized, and this is what was then copied so that the prospective hosts had 20 of these in their hand. We passed a similar kind of information to the interns. I believe it was actually less extensive, had the name of the firm, had something about the firm's location in Addis Ababa. We'll see that matters quite a bit. Something about the firm's sector and something about the firm's size. Now, before I go on and tell you about the average treatment effects, let me describe a little bit about the outcome of the mechanism. So here you see that most firms and most interns ended up with a preferred counterpart. What do I mean by that? What I've got here on the x-axis is I've got quintiles of ranking, and then I'm showing within those quintiles where people lay. So just to fix ideas, if we had randomly matched firms and interns within each batch, then by construction we would have 20% probability across all of these quintiles. What we have, if you look at it, is basically between 40 and 50% of interns and firms are being matched with a partner within their top 20%. And if we then add the top two bins, we get to about 70% of firms and interns being matched with someone in their top 40%. Shengwu.
How many firms in each batch?
Well, it would vary, but as a stylized fact, let me say 10. So 10, and it could vary because it's stochastic how many spots a firm wants to open up, and there was a lot of messing around to make that work. But let's suppose, to fix ideas, 20 interns turn up, 10 firms who are hosting. They're each opening 2 slots. Okay?
And can each side declare certain partners unacceptable?
No. No, they could walk away, which did not afterwards, which did not happen very often, but we did not allow that at all. Similarly, they couldn't declare ties. Similarly, we absolutely didn't want to deal with the kind of two-body problem where Shengwu and I really want to go to a firm together because it'll be fun, so we kind of sidestepped that. And as I say, people might have concerns about that. We'll talk about that later on, but I actually think in practice there was not a lot of interaction in a meaningful sense between the two. Yeah.
Just trying to understand the firm's incentives here and how they're ranking them.
Yeah.
At the end of it all, there might be a prospect of a job offer to the intern?
Yeah. I mean, in theory, yes. In practice, absolutely not. And I appreciate the question because it's worth clarifying. First, why did the firms do this? The answer is corporate social responsibility. These firms have other ways of basically screening for their managerial employees. They weren't going to get them through us. We went to them with a pitch that we're doing this research on management practices and it would be a useful way to help the youth and the next generation of Ethiopian managers, etc. And they took interns on that basis. And I think what we see in their preferences that they expressed is basically some sense of what's the kind of intern who would be a good match for us in terms of learning or a good fit within our firm. The second point to come to your question is we will find a wage effect. I can't remember if it's one person or 2 people who got jobs in their host firm. It is very close to absolutely nobody. So the wage effect that we're going to estimate is not coming from somebody being hired by the firm who hosted them. Yeah, please, Ben.
Preferences are pretty heterogeneous. Do you have a sense of what determines preferences?
Yeah, that's. I'm going to get to that. I spent way too much time modeling that, but anyway, I'll show you the results with some graphs later. I completely agree. I think it's a really important question for understanding what's going on in the background and also for thinking about counterfactuals. So let me come to that. Okay. Let me describe the implementation a bit before I tell you about the average treatment effects. So we collected administrative data and we had a short debriefing survey with participating firms and interns. And we think, even if we say so ourselves, that the program was implemented as intended. So on average, interns spent about 60% of their time in close collaboration with management. This is a bit of a challenge in the Ethiopian context. If you talk to Ethiopian firms and use the word internship, they think what you mean is that you're sending someone like a junior engineer who's going to spend her or his time working with the machines. So we had to explain very carefully to the host firms that this was actually a management experience and we wanted them to allow this person to kind of shadow the middle or senior management. So 60% of their time was spent doing that, and that time is divided as you see follows: planning and supervision tasks, bit of being idle, production worker tasks, very small proportion of time would the firm trust our interns to deal with clients. And I think that's a thoroughly reasonable decision. Interns and firms seemed generally satisfied with their matches, at least insofar as they were going to report back to us. So 65% of interns were satisfied, 80% of firms. It's not, of course, an incentivized decision, but this is at least what they tell us ex post. Alex.
Out of the people who got their first choice, how many people were satisfied?
Oh, no idea. I can look it up, obviously, but no, I haven't got.
This could just be, I'm unsatisfied because I didn't get my first choice, right? Because it's probably a little bit conservative.
Yes, that's a good point, but I haven't got that yet. Okay, how do we estimate? This is a standard ANCOVA specification. So we're going to, and this is all pre-specified in our pre-analysis plan, so we're going to take an outcome for intern I in pair P at follow-up time T, where follow-up time T either refers to a 6-month or 12-month survey. You could split it, but actually we pool it in our primary specification. It's ANCOVA, so we're going to control for the baseline value, and we're going to put in pairwise dummies to respect the stratification in terms of the randomization. So we've got loads more of these tables that I could bore you with in the paper, but I just want to show you a few. Here's our primary estimates in terms of the effect on occupation. And reading from the left, we look at the probability of being self-employed, and basically we see 0 effect on average. Look at self-employed hours and reported profit from self-employment, and again we find no effect. Let me just clarify here, when we say profit, this is in a sense unconditional. So if I'm not running a firm, I'm earning 0 profit from self-employment, and I go in that regression. So this is just thinking about the unconditional expectation of self-employment earnings. Then we move on and think about wage work. So we've got a small but statistically significant effect on wage work. Notice a couple of things down the bottom of column 4. At baseline, we've got a control group mean of 26% being employed. The average at follow-up is 64%. Now that is not a typo. This reflects the fact that we are looking for people at a crucial point in their career who are just coming out of quite a high level of education, who have high aspirations and motivations. So this is catching people at the transition point where they move into the labor force. So we've got a small and significant effect, even after controlling for multiple hypothesis testing, on a kind of rapidly moving base control group average. And this is reflected then in a significant effect on the probability of permanent work. If we ask whether the person has a job in managerial work, we do not find a significant outcome, but nonetheless it's reasonably close to significant. I don't want to make a big emphasis on that, but if you look at basically the new jobs that people are finding, they seem to be disproportionately in a managerial context, although that's not something we want to make confident statements about. As a result, they work longer in wage employment, and they also earn greater wage income. Now this is going to translate to about $10 per month, and that's not $10 per month per extra employee. That's on average across the treated group. People are getting $10 extra a month in wage income as a result of this intervention. Sima.
Hours or per day?
No, I think that's going to be, I think it's per month that I have to, sorry, no, I think you're right. I think it's, sorry, my mistake. No, I think it would be per day. Yeah, but then averaged again, as I said, the zeros go in there, so it's an unconditional expectation. Yeah. If we then narrow attention to the subset of people who are running a business, we look at the Mackenzie-Woodruff version of the Bloom and Van Reenen management practices questions. And this, of course, is just self-reports, but I think it's important and indicative. We can ask about overall management practices, marketing practices, recording practices, financial practices. We actually find large and significant increases in all of these, albeit, of course, among quite a small sample who are self-employed in this context. So the stylized fact is that on average, we don't push people into self-employment, but if someone was otherwise going to run a business, they run it better, or at least they're capable of reporting that they run it better as a consequence of our intervention.
So
Yeah.
I'm not seeing these self-reports. How obvious is it what the right answer is? Is this like a quiz, or am I just genuinely asking you, are you a good manager?
No, that's a good point. So it's going to be a series of individual questions, which are then going to be summed up, and we take an index, and we just absolutely follow what the literature does in that. I think on most questions you could probably guesstimate what the better answer is, but it's not completely obvious. But even if you're guesstimating what the correct answer is, I actually think that's still, in a sense, an important outcome in itself, that these people are more likely to put their hand up and recognize that something is potentially a good outcome. Yeah. Now, a bunch of other things that I won't tell you about. Sorry, Sima, yeah.
When you said this, like, are the firms that are being placed with, how good are they on management practices?
I haven't got the distribution of that, I'm sorry. We got quite a distribution. What I'll do in a minute is think about a median split, so exposure to a better managed or worse managed firm, but I'm actually not sure. That's a good point. We should.
I mean, like, if you take I would have thought most of these firms are really poorly managed according to this Bloom Van Reenen kind of measure. So.
That's a really good point. Let me next time I present it, contextualize it in the universe of possible firms. an incomplete, because I think it'd be interesting to compare it to what they get in other countries. To emphasize the point on size again, with a median firm size of 57, some of them will be well-managed hotels and banks and all sorts of other large manufacturing, but yeah. We tested a bunch of other things. We had randomization on the firm side, which I'm not going to talk about that. That's to say the host side. This allows us to test, does it change firm's stated preference about future interns? Do they say, well, we had Alex and we'd never want Alex again, for example? No, we find no effect on their stated preferences in either direction. I'm sorry, Alex. Doesn't change the firm's management practices. We thought potentially it could have an effect on HR and hiring practices. We have an unrelated paper about a job fair for less educated Ethiopians where participating firms actually went away from the fair and they decided to search in different ways. Our fair had kind of been sobering for their expectations about the market. We also tested whether interns have more similar attitudes to their hosts. So if I'm matched with a firm that really emphasizes customer experience, is this going to somehow make me more likely to say that customer experience matters? The answer is no. So we don't find any diffusion, if that's the word, on that kind of dimension. So that's my results on average treatment effects. Any other questions or things I should clear up before I charge back to the earlier question about preferences? Yeah. Eva, yeah.
You know, Suna's question seems to be very interesting
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that you can actually possibly correlate that with the almost significant coefficient.
Yeah, exactly.
Or the fact that you used the management practices they might have used it wrong.
Yeah.
And you distinguish if it really had an effect.
This is a very good point.
I think that's really.
No, thank you. And I think the stuff that I'll get to at the end is going to be a step in that direction, albeit not all of the way at the moment. So let me go on then and start talking about how we characterize preferences. I want to spend a few minutes talking about what we think that interns and firms cared about when they expressed these rankings. I think that's A, important just to understand what was going on in the background, and B, if we think we can do a reasonable job of characterizing those preferences, it will allow us to do counterfactual estimation in hopefully a credible way. That's the stuff I'll come to at the end. So what do we want here? Well, we want a model in which we can think of firms and interns as observing key characteristics of the other side of the market, forming a ranking which respects their utility ranking, and we want to do it in a way that respects the possibility that there's quite substantial heterogeneity. I don't want every Ethiopian firm to have the same preferences over someone's gender. I don't even want to say that every Ethiopian manufacturing firm or every Ethiopian large firm has the same preferences. So here's what we think is a reasonably flexible choice model that hopefully achieves that. So to fix ideas, we're going to think about utility for the firm, assessing a particular intern. That's little f for the firm, little I for the intern. We're going to use a standard additive random utility framework where we're going to think about vector wi as being characteristics of the interns and theta being preferences, or the preference weights if you like, for a firm. So then we've got an error term which is going to be a type 1 extreme value or a gumball equivalently. And what's more, we're going to allow that theta varies. We're going to allow theta to vary through a discrete finite mixture framework, and we're going to parameterize that using a multinomial logit. So what that means is we're going to allow for heterogeneity on unobservable characteristics, but we're going to allow that heterogeneity to then correlate and be informed by characteristics of the firm, which are here given by vector xf. So this is sometimes known as a placket-loose model or a rank-ordered logit. Those are equivalent terms. We're then going to flip the market around and do exactly the same thing on the other side, where we're going to have the utility that an intern perceives from assessing a firm is going to be a linear index of firm characteristics xf plus a type 1 extreme value error, and again we're going to allow for discrete finite mixture across types. So these can be a bit of a pain to estimate, coming back to my comment to Ben. So basically what we do is we use a multi-start expectation maximization algorithm, which provides a good starting point for a Metropolis Hastings algorithm, if you're into that kind of thing. Now, I do not know yet where we will send the paper. I will be sending the graphs to a museum of modern art, and my fear is that they may understand them better than I do. Let me show you what comes out of this estimating exercise, as I say, both to fix ideas and then also to provide a basis for the counterfactual. So here I've got a series of intern characteristics, and I'm thinking about firms' preferences. And on the x-axis, I've got the strength of feeling in the sense of the parameter theta. I've normalized it so that the standard deviation of our error term epsilon is now 1. So this is basically strength of feeling relative to the unobservable. So a couple of stylized facts emerge. The first is basically almost all Ethiopian firms in the experiment have a slight preference for women. Now, in discussions, Eva suggested that in the African context, that may be because women are perceived as being more reliable. This is something I discussed with Giram, our Ethiopian co-author. It's exactly his narrative too, that the narrative, rightly or wrongly, is that young women are going to be more reliable, more trustworthy, and that might be what's explaining this. Similarly, almost all Ethiopian firms have a moderate preference for people to have a degree. But then you get differences in types. Now, let me characterize what those types seem to be saying. The largest type has got 53% of our firms. Let me call that type 1. And as a caricature, a stylized fact, what makes type 1 firms type 1 firms? Well, I think what's striking is that they have a reasonably large preference for someone to have a business education. Type 2, 24%. What makes type 2 type 2? They have a reasonably large preference for someone to have a STEM education. So we've got important heterogeneity between firms based on the education of the potential host intern. Type 3, characterized by an off-the-chart large preference for interns to have a business education. And type 4 looks a little weird, but wait for it. They have an extremely strong preference for women, and they prefer people to be younger. Indeed. Now, who are those firms? This is basically describing vector theta. Now let me tell you about vector alpha, which is to say essentially the correlates in terms of firm characteristics with these types. Now let me explain how to read this graph and then we'll interpret it together. Here what I do is I look at key firm characteristics. I've got the numbers show the unconditional probability within the population. But what's interesting is that I then think about where that characteristic falls within the 4 different types of firms. If you see a characteristic, a bar coming to the number 1, that means that their representation in a particular type is the same proportion as their representation in the population as a whole. So now let's think about who these types are. Well, remember type 1 had a preference for business education. They are more likely to be manufacturing firms, less likely to be hospitality, and they're more likely to be firms with 50 or more employees. Type 2, remember these were firms who had a preference for a STEM education. These are massively more likely to be firms in manufacturing, as you might expect in terms of a preference for a STEM background. Remember type 3 had a kind of off-the-chart preference for people to have a business education. These firms are substantially more likely to be medium-sized firms and to be in hospitality. And the last type, only 5%, remember had a very strong preference for women and for young women at that. Of course, we're not sure exactly what's going on there, but it is interesting to note that these are, on the whole, smaller hospitality firms. So this is the kind of basic output from a characterization of firm preferences. Notice, by the way, that none of these bars go to kind of 0 or everything. So it's not the case that Ethiopian manufacturing firms believe one thing and Ethiopian hospitality firms believe another. We've got unobservable heterogeneity, which we then correlate to observable characteristics. Yeah?
How did you form these groups?
Oh, you let the algorithm do that. What we have to do is to choose the 4 types. So we have to choose the number of types, which is a pretty arbitrary choice in this literature. And then what the algorithm, it's essentially a kind of Bayesian classification algorithm that it's going to take different firms, it's going to try them in different groups, and it's going to keep trying. And if you think about it, what it's doing is if I look at your preferences, I've got a very rich data set that you've provided me by ranking all of these individuals. There's a lot of information in a ranking, but I also know that you're a manufacturing firm and most other manufacturing firms are in this type or that type. So I can actually also, I can use that information to help me infer, and essentially the latter becomes almost like a tiebreaker, not literally, but in terms of the way it enters the log likelihood. But anyway, that's basically how it works. Now, I will be very brief on the intern side, but this is the converse, different color palette. You'll notice that the striking thing about these interns is actually we don't find much heterogeneity at all. You have 83% of interns being put into type 1. And I think that their preferences are, as you would expect, they have a preference for being in larger firms rather than smaller. They would prefer to be in hospitality, but they don't really care about sector. And they have quite a strong preference for being in the same area of Addis Ababa. As I said, transport is a total pain in Addis. I won't say much more about that, but just notice that We actually don't then see a lot of correlation with firm characteristics. In particular, you might think that among our sample men and women might have very different preferences. In fact, this gender thing sits almost exactly on 1. So we really don't have any meaningful distinction on that dimension. Notice one other comment which may come up at one other point which may come up at the very end, which is that among this 83%, I think the preferences are interesting and quite sensible, but these bars are not large. That's to say there's still a huge amount of unmodeled heterogeneity which implicitly is coming through the error term, epsilon. So as a stylized fact, it seems to be the case that firms have a clearer idea, at least based on the observables we fed in. They seem to have stronger preferences, whereas interns there just appears to be a bit more noise in terms of their idiosyncratic assessments of what firms that they would like to be with.
So,
Shengwen.
it's not incentive compatible for interns?
Correct.
How do we deal with that?
Well, we deal with it in the hope that they basically reported honestly to us. We explain to them that we hope that they reported honestly. We imagine that, there are obviously arguments that we won't go into about regret aversion, that they might be worried about that. In practice, I think what's happening here is that they're coming across a mechanism they haven't seen before. We've explained to them that we would like them to give us an honest ranking, and then we're going to treat it as if it was honest. And in this context, I think that's about all we can do. But everything I say about alternative mechanisms at the end is going to assume that somehow we are happy to accept express preferences as the real preferences here. I'm not sure that it's a hugely strong assumption in practice, but this is not about trying to somehow find something that's incentive compatible on both sides. Yeah.
Just in this case, with so much incomplete information on your utility for matching the other side, the orientation of the algorithm really is second order, right? Because maybe the first order thing here is winner's curse. If you know that you're matched with somebody, you can deduce that it's likely that other people didn't want you.
Maybe, yeah. Or that they particularly wanted you. I'm not sure. We're not showing them the rankings, but yeah. Yeah.
So I was going to say what I thought Ran was about to say, which is it might be worth checking if the core is large or small, because it is small there.
I wink at my colleague Alex, who told me that. Exact words, actually. Yeah, and I said, Alex, I'm about to get on a plane. I can't check whether the core is large or small.
I said in a suite of more calculating algorithms.
Alex just checks the
I'll have a little bit to say about that at the end, actually. I agree that it will matter. It'll matter on my last slide. Okay, so then we want to ask ourselves, well, we use a controlled mechanism to assign interns to firms. So we know the information that was provided to interns and firms, and we make what we hope is a reasonable assumption about how that information enters our utility function. You may disagree, you may want a different specification, but to fix ideas, let's suppose that we've done that. We find a positive effect of being treated, but here's the key question. Does the effect depend upon the mechanism? Or equivalently, could an alternative mechanism have generated larger effects? Now, to fix ideas for the remainder of the talk, let me pose the question like this. Of course, we could think of a million variations on it, but let's suppose this. What's the occupational effect of being assigned to a high management host rather than a low management host? So we've got these host firms, as we discussed. We're going to measure their management practices using Bloom and Van Rienen's. We're going to do a median split. Does it matter that you get assigned to a better managed firm or a worse managed firm, or is it just that you got the opportunity to do this internship? Okay, now to fix ideas, in our mechanism, note that we control several things. We control the assignment of both sides of the market. We control the information set. We control the grouping of firms and interns, but we didn't randomize, brackets, among the treatment effect. So the idea I want to push is the following, that when we've got placement assigned using a fair centralized assignment mechanism, in a sense that respects equal treatment of equals, then we can identify the causal effect of this deterministic mechanism by a combination of modeling participants' preferences, which we've already done, and treating the composition of participants as a random variable. In other words, if we want to think about what's my probability of being matched with my host Alex, what we could plausibly do is that we could simulate a large number of alternative sets of peers who could have turned up with me, competing with me for Alex's favors, and we could work out in what proportion of those cases I end up being matched with Alex. Now, you might immediately think, well, hold on a minute, what if your peer is your friend? And okay, we've got to rule that out, but as I said before, I think that's a reasonable assumption. Yeah?
So this seems totally sensible.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. But why didn't you just randomize the assignment?
For a simple reason, which is that we would then be diluting the effect of the treatment. So there's this trade-off that we wanted to give the treatment the best chance of working, to see if this program could work at all. And now having done it, we want to go back and see whether we could have done a better job. And there's always going to be a trade-off if we throw sand into the machine, or stochastic elements, as it were, that you're going to be trading that off. Yeah.
Similar to what you could have randomized whether you had the firms or the workers' preferences. That would have like solved the instrument compatibility, and you could have done the math together. The other way. Like in half of them, it would have been interesting to know in half of them did Gale Travelers.
That's a good point. We kind of, I guess it's sort of inspired by, David Mackenzie and others trying to argue for a kind of homogeneous treatment that's as homogeneous as possible so that we can estimate our average treatment effects, and then we basically try to back that out using the method that I want to describe in a minute. I agree that if we'd come perhaps with a larger sample and with this question front and center, that we would have done it that way. But this is really trying to dig into the ATE question.
So more time travel. If you could go back in time, you could have gotten rank order lists from the people who had in the control group, and then done it differently.
Well, yes is the answer. We'd have even bigger questions about incentive compatibility. But no, that's true. You're absolutely right. We could have. Perhaps a lot of extra hassle, but yeah.
So in fact, I don't know if you're intending to do anything like that in the future, but you could have allowed them to express indifferences and then do the randomization yourself, and
yeah.
You would get the...
Exactly. So if there's indifferences, then you get very close to the framework of Abducattarolo in this context, because that's where I completely agree, that's where you end up with a stochastic element. We're going to take a different approach, which I'll show you right now. So let me, in the last 10 minutes, let me formalize. Sorry, Michael, I didn't see.
This might be what you're doing,
yeah.
But people went through in waves. So
Correct.
You're using people from the other waves.
We're going to use the distribution of people from other waves to fit, yeah. I mean, another thing I would do if I had a time machine and a lot of patience from my participants is that I would also ask people to rank firms in the wave ahead of them and the wave behind them. That's also something that we couldn't do in practice, but that would also allow us to do that. But yeah. Okay, so let me hit you with some formal math just to finish. So what we want to do is the following, just to formalize what we think our mechanism did. Imagine that the firm F's ranking over interns I is the following. So F is going to index an individual firm. I here is indexing a set of interns who are being assessed. And we're going to get a vector which is going to be drawn from a probability mass function over the set of possible rankings that you could give. And that function is going to be driven exactly in the way I've just described by the characteristics of the intern and the preferences of the firm. And then exactly symmetrically, we can say the same thing about the intern's ranking over a firm. Now, with those ideas in mind, what we did then is that the assignment, which will have matrix M matching a set of interns to a set of firms, are then determined by a mechanism which, as you all know, just basically takes the stacked set of intern rankings and the set of firm rankings and combines them, in this case using the deferred acceptance algorithm that I described. So how do we go from this to a propensity score? What we would like to do is to get a propensity score, that's to say a probability that I is matched with F, conditional on I's ranking, which we want to hold fixed because that could correlate with outcomes. Conditional on I's characteristics, we want to hold that fixed because that could correlate with outcomes. Conditional on the characteristics and the preferences of the set of firms, because that also is potentially going to correlate with outcomes because my host firm is in that set. We can do that by integrating this match function over a probability distribution of the joint distribution of intern characteristics and intern preferences. In other words, what I can do is imagine the set of peers who could have turned up instead of the set of peers who actually did turn up. Set of peers defined both by the characteristics of the peer and also their preferences. Remember that in the model I set up earlier, by construction, we allowed for a correlation between intern characteristics and intern preferences. We have some parameter uncertainty in our model, and we want to integrate that out as well. Notice that this object here is a function of firm preferences. We want to integrate over that. So how do we get the distribution, the joint distribution of intern characteristics and intern preferences? Well, we can get, and this really comes to Michael's question, we can get a non-parametric estimate of the density of intern characteristics. In other words, we look at the sessions that are nearby to my session and my own session to learn something about the kind of interns who could have turned up at the time that I turned up. And the estimates I just showed you about preferences then they give us the conditional distribution of preferences given those characteristics. For firm preferences, we could do a little bit better, because when we look at the way that the given firm ranked the actual set of interns, that tells us, in most cases with pretty near certainty, what type of firm that is. So we're actually going to use a conditional distribution of firms' preferences given the firm's recorded rankings. We integrate that thing out as well. I'm going to skip equal treatment of equals. Let me show you a couple of things. The first is, on the x-axis here, I have the simulated probability of match. Now, just to fix ideas, if I claim that I have a 10% probability of being matched with Alex, you better hope that in about 10% of those cases we observe a match. So, and that's what we do get. So we're looking for a 45-degree line. I'm going to claim that's 45 degrees-ish. Good enough. What can we do about this? This is what I want to finish on. We can then take these estimated or simulated probabilities of matches, and we can work out a propensity score. What's the probability that I was matched with a high management firm? We can then use that as a running variable, in this case, to think about the estimated treatment effects. So here I'm going to think about the probability of getting a wage job. I'm going to think about how that probability varies with the probability of a high management host, depending on whether you're assigned to a high management host or a low management host. Now, to fix ideas, this is the control group mean here, which I've normalized everything to 0. And this dotted line, which is not a function, it's just intended to fix a value. This is the estimated effect at the 12-month mark. I didn't show you this, but we get estimated effect of just over 2%. So here's our estimate. This is the effect of being assigned to a low management host. So this is a firm that has low management, and it seems that, across the distribution, it doesn't really matter what your probability of match is. If you're assigned to a low management host, they all seem to have a causal effect of around about 3 percentage points. What if you're assigned to a high probability host? And here we see some suggestion of some interesting heterogeneity, that the effect of being assigned to a high management host seems to be heterogeneous in terms of whether you were really damn lucky and perhaps didn't deserve to be there, or whether you're the kind of person who was meant to be matched with a high management host. Okay? But not too stark. We can then ask ourselves, well, what if we used another mechanism, the simplest mechanism being a random match? And once you have these objects in hand, it's actually really easy to work out a random match, because instead of having what I'm showing here is the density in terms of the underlying probability of a high management host, instead you integrate over this, but you just assign probabilities a half and a half rather than probabilities p and 1 minus p. And basically we estimate that we had a slightly larger effect, that's the black horizontal line, on the probability of wage employment by using our matching algorithm, as opposed to the green dotted line, what would have happened if we'd used a random match. More interesting, perhaps, is what happens if we look at self-employment. Looking here at the probability of self-employment, remember that the estimated pooled effect is 0. In fact, if you look at the 12-month follow-up, there's suggestive evidence that you might have a 2 percentage point effect. How does that differ? Well, here we find that basically if you're assigned to a host firm with management quality below the median, then you really don't have any effect in terms of whether you yourself start a firm. What about if you're assigned to a firm that has high management quality? The answer is you do have an effect on the probability of self-employment if you have a high probability of having a match having that match. So if I'm the kind of person who was born to be matched with a high quality firm, I actually am going to do better in terms of probability of starting a firm. And again, this slightly worrying suggestive evidence that maybe high probability firms get a bit annoyed in the small number of cases where they're matched with someone who wasn't really supposed to be there. I don't want to overstate that given the confidence intervals, but you see this positive slope. And again, we can then do the same exercise and ask, I'll just be one more minute, and ask what happens if we use random matching. Here, we estimate that you would have basically about half the effect if we'd use random matching as opposed to purposive matching. Let me generalize this one more way, if that's okay, before I stop. And that is that what I have just done is I've compared deferred acceptance with firm proposal to a random match. But you might say, well, what about some other mechanism that I can come up with? The obvious candidate would be deferred acceptance with intern matching, but there could be all sorts of others. The answer is, because we've set up the machinery and the assumptions in order to simulate the probability of a match under the actual assignment, there's nothing to stop us simulating the probability of a match under some alternative mechanism that you can come up with. So suppose that the actual mechanism is mechanism A, you come up with some other mechanism, call it mechanism B. We can repeat the previous integration, but instead of replacing with a half and a half, I'm going to work out the probability of a match under the alternative mechanism. Notice that what I need to do in this world is I need to think about the joint distribution of probabilities of match, and this is where we come back to Shengwu/Alex's point, because if the core is small, this is going to basically describe a distribution very close to a 45-degree line, and you're going to get back the same effect. In other words, it doesn't matter. On the other hand, if this is a cloud of points, then it could matter a great deal. I think it's a cloud of points, but this is something that I'm still working on. And this, I think, is interesting. We have not invented the wheel here. There is obviously a long literature in treatment effects that talks about marginal treatment effects and talks about how if you're worried about a mean treatment, it can always be expressed as a weighted average of different marginal treatment effects. What we think is novel here is to marry that idea with the idea that we can take marginal treatment effects with respect to a matching outcome. What we hope is that this then opens all sorts of possibilities to think in a rich way about counterfactual mechanism design, where we can think about a wide range of counterfactual mechanisms without having to go back and run a new experiment. Although, of course, we would always be keen to do that too. I'm exhausted. I don't know about you. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks for your questions. Yeah.
So one obvious counterfactual would be to sort of optimize on a particular outcome rather than thinking about a mechanism with nice properties, right? So did I understand this right? So this, you have enough information in here to be able to say, suppose I wanted to just optimize, or let's not do self-employment, but the previous one, which was like if I wanted to maximize the total wages that could have been earned under these constraints, you could have done this in principle here too.
I want to say I think so. Well, with these estimates in hand, which is a different kind of question, but with these estimates in hand, I think you could go back and you could probably say, well, where do I find the greatest effect here? Can I come up with a mechanism that would basically arbitrarily change these probabilities given my estimated effects here? Yeah, I mean, that would be another application of the point made by Heckman and Wittler-Chill in several papers.
So I've been asked to comment on this paper that does not exist yet. This elusive paper, Learning by Managing, a field experiment with aspiring entrepreneurs, is part of a research program on improving labor market in the developing countries, in this case Ethiopia. And the research group consists of a bunch of people. I think you might have mentioned Giro, Marcel, Michael, and yourself, but there's a bunch of others too. I have been exposed to several versions of PowerPoint presentation and a lovely phone conversation by Skype with Simon, from which I also learned a lot. It's indeed a very important topic with enormous ramification, of course, because labor market as an institution in a national system of institutions is crucial for stability of a society. So let me tell you a bit about what I'm going to talk about. I have organized my thoughts about this research in the following way. I'm going to talk about the importance of defining a research problem. I'm going to talk about the importance of what the intentions with the intervention design in the field are, and in particular what the actual mechanism at work might be. I will discuss issues around causality. What is the intervention actually doing? Does the intervention cause the outcome, and in what way or not? Why do we use a particular tool to solve a problem? In this case, what seems to be defined as a matching problem? For example, why do we use a particular algorithm such as the Gale-Shapley algorithm? Why applying it in the way you do? When doing an intervention in the field, what is the kind of environment setting you are exposed to? In particular, what is the institutional environment and what bearing does it have on the intervention and its implication. Finally, if time permits, I will provide you with some reflections of my own. I've been thinking that this adventure, commenting on a paper that does not yet exist, could of course be a nerve-wracking project. Commenting on something that takes on fluid character and so on, even more exciting. PowerPoint presentation appearing in my mailbox every other day or so. In particular exciting, given that we, the commentators, are supposed to be brilliant in the kind of comments we give, and we're supposed to better the paper, I guess. However, there's a positive side to it all, the fact that papers have yet to be materialized, There's an opportunity here to influence it in a fundamental way without making the poor scholars having to go through many iterations. Good comments can make the whole process quicker, and in the discussion, the discussant will learn stuff that else would get lost in translation, and hence maybe provide better quality. And the discussions with the scholars per Skype or face-to-face, as with Marcel, have been both very informative. I've learned a lot, both about the substance and what it's like to be a scholar with small kids that get sick all the time. Let me get back to defining the problem. So again, the research question is, can aspiring entrepreneurs acquire management skills by observing managers in medium and large firms? This question seems to be answered with a no. But as we saw from the presentation, the intervention had some other positive consequences. Wage employment increased in the intervention group. The group used random assignment of firms to young newly graduate individuals, and a Gale-Shapley matching algorithm is applied, and as I understand, they have firms propose positions to the young and hungry. The problem is, why is the functioning of a labor market so important, and why does managerial skill, why does that have anything to do with a well-functioning labor market? One of the more fundamental institutions in the society is a well-functioning of a labor market. Low entrepreneurial activities translates into low investment economic value generating projects, and hence slow growth of firms and firm size, which in turn is correlated with small labor market, restricted employment opportunities, and high unemployment. Lots of friction on the labor market, in particular in the developing economies, is associated with clan mentality, corruption, and plain problems of information about potential employees and employers. Therefore, we get an inefficient matching of skills to tasks, hence lots of frustrated expectation both among employers and employees. And apart from the inefficient matching of skill and task, employee or potential employees get little opportunity to do work on managerial skills. And therefore a labor market that do not generate managerial experienced managers and leaders, which leads to fewer entrepreneurial projects and less economic growth and increased welfare for the society. Less increase. So this is very important. It's a very important problem. So the situation in Ethiopia, I'm guessing, is actually that there is a demand of certain employees with certain kinds of skills or interest in learning by doing. There's a supply of young graduates that try to find a good labor market career trajectory, partly in order to get the essential experience that is useful for starting a new company. Okay? But the problem, as stated in the PowerPoint, is to assist young graduate students aspiring to start new companies. Is this truly a relevant problem, and is this even a good thing for a country like Ethiopia? Why, if that's so? And how would these new startups increase employment rates in general, and hence growth and well-being in Ethiopia? I will come back to this a little bit. So what are the stated mechanisms at work? The research problem is defined as, does learning by observing managers work for a month somehow increase the young and aspired chances to start their own business? Learning by doing is one thing, but learning by watching is another. What do we know about that and as a way of building knowledge? And is a month enough, even if you're just watching? I'm just asking, is there a shortage of managerial skills in Addis? How do you get managerial skill in Ethiopia generally? Through working in public companies, churches or private organizations? What is the nature of the lack of managerial skill in this country? I'm just curious. If true that managerial skill is faltering here, taking young newly graduate students as interns for 4 weeks, is that the way to go? Management is something you learn by doing, yes, but it takes a while. So let me tell you about this a bit. Let me give you some insights from stories about successful exporters of great managers. IBM, for example, they train their potential managers in many different positions for a very long time, and they become exporters of great managers. So does the Swedish Handelsbank. The CEO that I have interviewed a couple of times tells me that if you want to build managerial skills, which by the way might be different from managerial practices. If you want to build managerial skills, you want to try the people in certain kind of tasks and see, do they solve these tasks in a satisfactory way? Yes, they go on. They get more and more difficult tasks. Do they solve these good? Fine, they go on. Then you take a potential manager to completely different task. If they can solve that too, they're in the pool of managers. So, managerial skills is a long, it's a long training. And it's a certain kind of training, I think, too. The need to create startups or entrepreneurs. Why? Why does Ethiopia need more small or even one-man companies? I thought often the problem in these countries is to make sure small companies grow to medium-sized or large company. I always thought that the problem in developing countries and employment is more of a scaling up problem. The scaling up partly demands managerial skills, of course. So Bob Lucas' 1973 paper really points to this, that the fewer good managers you have in a country, the more skewed the distribution of firm sizes. The more managerial skills you have in a country, the more it entails the medium-sized corporations and the more employment opportunities, obviously, because you can have more of this. Let me talk a bit about causality and mechanisms at work. Why exactly do we expect that this intervention will create more entrepreneurs? And by the way, entrepreneurial skill is very different from managerial skills. Now, we see that this intervention creates more wage employment, which is a good thing, it's positive. Now, why is that? Could the mechanism be really becoming visible in these companies? So you get a network effect, so people can recommend you to others. Is it possibly that you get, as an intern, an experience from just, I can show you I have had a first job. I've been inside the walls of a firm. And this new entrance is job for educated people, especially in clan and segregated labor market societies, is extremely important. So you got foot in. And now I can go on because I can say to the next employer, yes, I've been in this program. I'm a bit special. I have special competencies. And could the mechanism be that I actually have readjusted my expectations and my aspirations in the sense that I know more what I can actually expect from the labor market, and I adjust my job search? I could imagine an incentive effect also, in the sense that I work much harder to get that job because I'm turned on becoming a manager. Algorithms, I don't know much about this kind of research. I'm really not the right person to talk about it. Sometimes, though, talking to Alex and his gang and looking at this, I have a feeling that sometimes the tail is wagging the dog. So instead of the other way around. So I just suggest and encourage all these people to figure out, as social scientists, I think it's really important that we do define the problem first, in the sense that we are sensitive of what's actually going on here. That is not something that you, as economists, are trained for. Sociologists, to a higher extent, are trained there, but they're lost in the forest, unfortunately. And so we need to merge these two different kinds of ways of doing research, I think. Just in parentheses, I've just tried to make my students at Stanford to combine finding out from the experts, learning, understanding the data. Might take, an extra day or a couple of hours in interviews, explorative ethnographic work or something. Then use that to use some machine learning, some thought, and deriving some hypothesis, and then using those hypotheses to test on a representative longitudinal survey of some sort. It's just using different kinds of methods in order to extract, what is the problem here. I am just curious, why did you decide to have the firm propose rather than the aspiring students? I think that would be interesting. We need an institutional analysis when we do these things, I think. The environment in which the field experiment is taking place, we've talked about that already. What kind of ownership situation are we talking about here? What kind of rule of law? Is it social peace enough to try to start up your company? I'm thinking of the Bloom, Nix and Apraji's work in India. One of the big eye-openers in their work is why the managerial practices were not installed. And they actually did not really discuss it properly in the paper. But one reason is that in India they have these patriarchal family-run business generally. And the old guy, the grandfather, has always done the things he's always done. And there's no incentive for him because he's soon going to go to change anything. And so even if his sons or daughters would love to do something, they really can't. So that means that the people that are working both on the floor and as managers of the company do never get the right incentives to enforce managerial practice. And I think, so even if they know about these things, even if they're educated from the Harvard Business School, they're still not going to implement them necessarily. And I think it's really important to have an institutional analysis of where we are. These young, aspiring graduates, are they going to go out and start their new companies? Are they going to lend money from their families? Are they going to lend it from the bank? What happens if they fail? Are they going to have to eat these consequences for the rest of their lives? So I think it's really interesting to know. Not 0 minutes?
0.
Okay, very good. So I'm really done. I just want to say that entrepreneurial competence is not necessarily the same as managerial competence, and even if Ethiopia needs more entrepreneurial projects, corporate governance, institutions such as rule of law, financial markets, and so on are really important to think about. And the more medium-sized and large companies we get, the more employment and opportunities we get, and the more opportunities to train managerial skills is what I'm thinking. So I just want to give you some insight about how to think about framing maybe the paper, because the outcome, more wage employment is good. Right?
Awesome, thank you.
Awesome.
Yes, maybe we have time for a question. Please.
Oh, whatever. Whatever.
You can email me about this talk every day. I'm happy to see all future PowerPoint presentations. I think it's great. And Lavin and Ralston talk about all of this money's been spent on entrepreneurship training, and a lot of people are interested in seeing what are alternatives, because they've gotten big zeros on all this stuff. And another big question is the selection into entrepreneurship. So if all the best kids go to work domestically for IBM, where are the great entrepreneurs domestically in Africa going to come from? Right, so looking at how you can kind of nudge people and whether this is great. I had 2 questions. One is kind of to what extent is it norms and non-cognitive skills that they're learning through the entrepreneurship that help them in the job market later on? And then kind of it seems like the mechanism would have a lot of randomization and tie breaking, and it seems like there you could almost use that to identify what are the effects of getting my top choice or something like that. Not using, which I love, that whole GPV looking counterfactual, that's awesome. I love it. But you could maybe use the randomization in the mechanism itself to address some of these questions as well, and then kind of pick those up. I don't know. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Awesome.
So let me briefly take those in reverse order. So just to be clear, the mechanism has no randomization in it because we didn't allow people to express ties. I guess we could dig further if we wanted to know what's the effect of first choice rather than second. We might run into an exclusion restriction, a bit like a kind of Hawthorne effect, that if I'm really thrilled that I got my first choice and that has some additional effect, that might actually be a problem, to be honest.
Okay.
See what I mean? But let's talk more about that. Norms and non-cognitive skills, I want to go back and have a look. I think we have some questions in there which I haven't dug into yet about that, just to know descriptively whether it changed people's attitudes. We did have a bunch of questions I didn't discuss today about planning. For example, someone says they haven't started a business. Have they done a bit of research to know how they would get a license to start a business, etc.? In short, no. So these people, so we do have some preparatory kind of intermediate steps that we could look at, but I need to look further. I think it's a good suggestion.